want to talk about namespaces. So first I want to show you some code using namespaces in our Hello World program, and then we'll get into more detail about what exactly a namespace is. So first of all, I'm going to just comment out this line, and I'm going to type this command. So using namespace. So basically what this does is this says that we're going to be using the standard namespace. And the reason so there are a lot of sort of identifiers in the standard namespace, and the one that we specifically need in this program is cout. So cout is in the standard namespace. And so that's why, like if I comment this line out, I can use this one where I have using standard and then cout. And another way that you could do this, so you'll see this all of these ways, if I comment this out, is I can just put the standard here, and then that's going to say that I'm using cout from the standard namespace. For this class, I recommend doing either this, so using the standard cout or using namespace standard. And so your textbook has this, using namespace standard. A lot of programmers consider using just broadly saying using namespace standard is considered bad programming practice. And the reason why is because it can cause errors later on. And I'm going to talk about what kinds of errors you can get in a minute. But for this class, the using namespace standard is going to be fine. So let's go into the presentation. So the reason why we have namespaces at all is because programs have become more and more complex. And most programs are a combination of our code, the C++ standard library, and libraries from third-party developers. So basically, with all of these things combined together, like we're writing our code, we're using the C++ standard library, we might be using a library from a third-party developer, so that might be a library that your company has specifically developed, or it could be something through an open source package. And so basically there can be situations where something can have the same name. And when that happens, the compiler won't know which one to use. So basically you end up with a naming conflict. So for an example of that, let's suppose that there's another library that has cout defined. So if that happens, the compiler isn't going to know which one to use. So for example, let's say that I have, so basically namespaces are containers that group our different entities. So for instance, let's say that for whatever reason, I want to redefine cout so it's different, so it does something different in my code. So I could define a namespace called RT code for Riley Taylor code, and then I could define cout in this namespace, and then I could use my definition of cout by saying RT code and then cout. So then what this is going to do is going to tell the compiler that the definition of cout that I'm using is in this namespace rather than the standard namespace or some other namespace. And so that's why to use cout in the standard library, we use standard : cout. So we're basically telling the compiler that we're using the cout that's in the standard namespace. And this operator right here, the double colon, this is called the scope. So the scope resolution operator. And basically this resolves which namespace we want to use. And so it can be tedious to type standard : on every single time we want to use something from that namespace, because it turns out we're going to see as we move along in the class that there are a lot of things in that namespace that we want to use. And so that's why people use the using namespace standard, or they use the using standard cout at the top of their program, because then they don't need to type the standard : in front of everything that happens to be in that namespace. And so the problem with this is this says that we're using this basically says that we're using the entire standard namespace. And so if we have large programs, which if you're working for a company or you're a developer, you're probably going to be working on a large program. And this, you can end up with clashes. So like you might have, like what if your company has a namespace that also defines cout differently. So then if you have the using namespace standard, that can cause a possible conflict with another namespace that you might be using. So basically there can be a possible naming conflict. So like I said, for this class, I think it's okay to just use the using namespace standard, because we're going to mainly be writing pretty small programs, and this is what your book uses, so I don't want to tell you can't use it. But just know for future that if you, as you move on in your programming career or become a developer, you're going to want to kind of move away from using that and start doing things like this, or putting the standard : in front of whatever it is that's from the standard namespace.